Welcome, everybody, to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends. Today, we're going to be talking to a guy by the name of Tim, Alberta, Canada, as I call him.
Tim Alberta, author of a new book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, staff writer at The Atlantic. And you guys may remember his first book that he wrote called American Carnage, which was like bestseller about the rise of Trump and all that sort of stuff.
So he's an evangelical Christian who looks at evangelical Christians sucking off Donald Trump, and he's like, this is not what you guys are supposed to be about.
Yes,
that's the
right.
gist of Tim, Alberta, Canada. So it'll be interesting to get into the specifics with him. I'm actually really looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, I talked to him before, and it was a great conversation, so that's why we wanted to spend more time with him.
Yeah, so if you're just watching this on YouTube and you're only seeing the intro, this is a teaser clip. Go listen to the full thing, the full audio podcast for free if you'd like, or you could sign up on Substack below, $5 a month. You'll get the full interview, the video of it, and you'll get it a day early. All right, so before we get into that, though, this has been the big story that everybody's talking about, and I understand why that is. It makes perfect sense to me that this is on the top of everybody's mind. But of course, Donald Trump was effectively kicked off of the presidential ballot in the state of Colorado after the Supreme Court of Colorado ruled in a 4-3 decision. You violated Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which is like the disqualification clause, which basically says if you engage in an insurrection or aid and assist people who engage in an insurrection or give comfort to them, then you're not allowed to run.
Right.
And so they kicked him off. Now, at the same time, this is the part that everybody needs to remember. There's other states where they came to the exact opposite conclusion. So in North Carolina, for example, they just had, I don't know if it was the court that decided it or if it was just election officials in North Carolina, but they said, no, we have no authority to kick him off the ballot. He's on the ballot. And I think there's been over a dozen of these sorts of cases coming up in different states.
Yeah.
And most of those, I believe it's 8, Trump actually won.
Okay.
So he's won in more states than he's lost on this constitutional question.
I think the number I saw was that there were 18 of the challenges.
Oh, 18.
But I think you're right that not all of them have made their way through the courts.
No, yeah.
But so far, many of them have, and this is the first one that they have prevailed on saying he should get kicked
this is
off.
the first one where Trump lost, but there are other cases that are adjacent to this where Trump's side lost also. We can get into that in just a second. But so now this is a big deal. It's going to go to the Supreme Court, and they're going to make a decision. Is he allowed to run or is he not allowed to run? Now, everybody that I see is just sort of assuming, well, of course the Supreme Court is going to side with Trump.
Yeah.
And I actually have not a disagreement, but I disagree with the emphasis because people are saying, like, for sure they're going to lean that way. I'm not as sure as everybody. I think it's like a 65% chance Trump's side wins, but 35% is an actual shot. And I can explain why I think that. But
yeah,
go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I'm more in the 95-5 category. So
not even 90-10. See, I find that crazy, to be honest.
I'm more skeptical than you. And the reason I actually think, so first of all, we can talk about some of the like legal analysis here, which I think is important. We can get to that, but I also don't want to kid ourselves that like that's what these justices on the court actually do. They decide what decision they want to make through their like partisan and ideological lens, and then they sort of work backwards from there, is my experience. I suspect that in their heart of hearts, there probably is a majority on the court that would love to be done with Donald Trump forever. I also suspect that they do not have the balls to actually kick him off the ballot. They don't want that decision to have to rest with them and for them to be the ones who are ultimately pushing him out of public life.
Okay, so here's my reaction to that.
Yeah.
Number one, this point I keep making over and over. These are not MAGA Republicans on the Supreme Court. They're just not. They're way more like Mitt Romney.
Outside of Alito, Clarence Thomas, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's 2 for sure. But the rest of them are just not that, because these are like highly educated Ivy League elites, okay? And they're very consistent on all corporate and economic issues. They are not at all consistent on social issues. So that's the first 2 points. Beyond that, guys, there are even Trump-appointed Republicans who slapped down some of those 61 cases that Trump brought to try to overturn the election. So his own appointed justices, who everybody assumed would ideologically be like really with him on all this stuff, not only did they say, no, Trump, you're losing this, it's like, your case is so stupid, you don't even have standing, get out of my courtroom, right? So that's just an example of oftentimes these judges are more intelligent and intellectual than like your average run-of-the-mill MAGA Republican who is representing some district deep in rural Georgia or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that I think that I also think they all want Nikki Haley, and the donor class, they want Nikki Haley. They're giving Nikki Haley all this money. Well, the remaining alive Koch brother is giving Nikki Haley all this money, and I think that the court is actually deeply in alignment with the donor class, as we've seen a lot with the Justice Thomas stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised. And here's the main point too: if you really want to make the decision, they have everything they need to make the decision. I mean, if you read the actual text of the Constitution on this issue, it's like, oh, that obviously applies.
So I have the text in front of me just because I do think if you just take like the plain face reading of it, most normies are going to be like, yeah, that sounds about right.
And they are saying that. We'll get to that in a minute.
They say, no person shall hold any office, civil or military, under the United States who, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Very simple to understand, and I think most people overwhelmingly feel like January 6th is appropriately classified as an insurrection. Clearly, all those people who stormed the Capitol and were like, 1776, we're doing this thing, they were there at the behest of Donald Trump. The presidency, most people would say, is an office of the United States.
Although a lower court in Colorado said the opposite. They were like, no, he did commit an insurrection, but the presidency is not an office, so this doesn't apply.
Okay.
That's literally the dumbest ruling I've ever heard.
But I do think, and we'll talk about this, the poll that just came out in a moment, just like the normie reading of that, based on commonly understood definitions and language, you go like, yeah, that actually kind of fits to a T.
Yeah, and the other point that I find very interesting is there is some precedent in adjacent cases which may have surprising results for people. So there was a New Mexico official who was removed from office simply because he was at January 6th. So they said, oh, you were partaking in this insurrection.
It was like a sheriff, right?
No, I originally thought it was a sheriff, but actually I don't.
It was like
ultimately
a
wasn't a sheriff.
County supervisor or something like that. Yeah.
And then, but there's also, this is one example. I believe there's actually another example too, but I was looking for it the other night when this decision came out, and I couldn't find the details of it. But I remember covering another. So there's at least two examples of a court saying you partook in insurrection and this violates the Constitution. You can't hold any elected office, and so they kicked him out. So in other words, the Supreme Court has enough there if they want to. So I guess the thing that's been frustrating me is when people pretend like in a very glib and smug way, they act like, well, there's nothing here.
Yeah.
Like, no. If you want to take that position, fine. If you want to side with Trump, fine. But like, give me an actual argument and address the actual points. Because I've seen literally, I'm not kidding, nobody who's like, Trump should be able to run. Nobody actually makes an argument. It's just like, like, okay, can you make a point?
Yeah, so a lot of the people who are arguing that Trump should be able to run, the basic case that they're making is like democracy. Like, this should be up to the voters, and the voters should have the final say, and it shouldn't be left up to the courts. Like, this is how the process works. Trump should be able to run, and people should be able to decide for themselves whether they think he should be president of the United States again. That, to me, is not taking, like, there's no legal argument there. The real argument that's being made there, in my opinion, is just you don't think that this section of the 14th Amendment should exist. You don't think that there should be any circumstances where a candidate is kicked off the ballot for committing an insurrection or rebellion. You just disagree with this whole idea, which, I mean, that's fine. That's a legitimate position you could take. It's not a position I agree with, though, because I think that the state has an interest in being able to bar from office people who have directly attacked or tried to undermine the state. So I think it's entirely reasonable, appropriate, and good that we have that in the Constitution, and then it becomes a matter of applying it. And granted, I think it's tricky. There's very little precedent here. There's really nothing on the books in terms of, okay, what is the technical definition of an insurrection? And importantly, who gets to decide? Because that's one of the legal questions here, too, is does a state court get to look at this text of the Constitution, decide what's an insurrection, and then apply it? Or does someone have to be found guilty in a court of law? Does there have to be an act of Congress that is passed in order to determine this or that thing was an insurrection and now this actually applies? That's all left, like, we don't know. We don't have answers to any of those questions. So the way this court interpreted it is kind of honestly like the normie way, like, okay, here's the definition of an insurrection. I'm looking at, this is the Merriam-Webster definition, an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or an established government. Check. That sure sounds like it fits. Did Donald Trump engage in or give aid and comfort to someone who was engaged in insurrection? I think it'd be pretty hard to deny that that wasn't the case. So they're like, all right, so it meets all the criteria. And by the way, obviously the presidency is an office of the United States. So there we go. But you know, that's why we have a Supreme Court to take this up and lay out, okay, here are the guidelines. Here's what it does mean. Here is what the process is supposed to do. But like I said, I think most of the people who are having a reaction against this, they really don't care about the legal analysis. They just seem to be opposed entirely to the idea this should even be a provision in the Constitution at all.
Okay, but here's the problem with that. These same people should be screaming from the rooftops to repeal our term limits that we have on the president. Because that is, by definition, undemocratic.
Yeah.
You're saying you're not allowed to vote for this person a third time.
Or like the age limit, or the, you know, this one I agree with, but the natural born citizen limit.
Yeah, and so it's like, all right, well then be consistent. But they only invoke it in this instance, and I think you're right. The argument that they're implying is, well, you know, this shouldn't even be in the Constitution. And it's like, I want to hear you actually address, like, the points, right? So the best argument I've heard on the other side is, he hasn't been convicted of insurrection yet. And in fact, he wasn't even charged with insurrection, whether it be in the Georgia cases or from Jack Smith. And I genuinely think that's a fair point. But the reaction to that is like, but we can also just let the Supreme Court decide now if indeed it was an insurrection, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is like people, oh my God, there's been no due process. This is the due process.
Right.
Like, we are watching the due process unfold.
Right.
And by the way, all these people, it's funny because they seem to think or say, oh, well, the Supreme Court's obviously going to side with Trump. But then they melt down over it anyway, and they're like, this shouldn't even be a case. And I don't understand that. If it's going to be a slam dunk, then isn't it just like rubbing it in everybody's face? Say Trump was right, Trump was right.
Right. Then it's like, all right, well, relax. You're going to get your way. So.
And it's the same thing with the 91 criminal charges also. The stuff around election subversion where they tried to overturn the election and the fake electors scheme. And it's like, Trump is still saying to this day that the election was stolen from him. Right. And it's like, okay, you're literally going to get your day in court multiple times in Georgia and in D.C. with the federal case to say, told you I'm right. Look, it's stolen. Here's all my evidence I'm presenting. We all know that's not going to happen because the election wasn't stolen from him, right? And so on this one, again, I think he's likely to win it. But at the same time, I think it'll be more interesting and maybe even closer. Like I heard Sagar say to you the other day, oh, it's either going to be 9-0 or like 7-2. I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer than that. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer than that.
I have no idea. I don't want to wait. But I mean, it's like I said, to me, the controlling principle is the cowardice of the court, which is why I think it's very, very, very likely that they strike this down because they just aren't willing to insert themselves this directly into history. And also given, I mean, this shouldn't be a factor, but I'm sure they'll be thinking in the back of their heads, and Trump is going to play this up and already is playing this up, this idea that country's a tinderbox and they're going to freak out. I mean, the Trumpist movement has basically turned themselves into like terrorists holding everybody hostage, that everyone's terrified of like pissing them off.
He's lighting the match and he's like, the country's on fire. It's like, you're lighting the fucking match.
Right. But that threat, you know, looms large in the minds of many of these people. So that's why I feel like it is very unlikely to succeed at this Supreme Court.
But now let me give everybody the numbers because this is really interesting. So it's a new poll from YouGov. Among all U.S. adults, what percentage approve of the Colorado Supreme Court ruling? 54%. Only 35% disapprove of the Colorado ruling.
Interesting.
So a majority of the country says, yeah, kick him off the ballot.
Yeah,
and he can't go on the ballot.
Points.
Now I'll give you the deeper breakdown here. Democrats, 84% support kicking him off the ballot. Only 8% oppose. Independents, 48% support kicking him off the ballot. Only 35% oppose. So it's a strong plurality of independents too. Yeah. And even when you get to Republicans, 66% of Republicans don't want to kick him off the ballot, but 24% do, which is more than I would have thought.
That surprised me, actually. That was kind of the most surprising number to me.
So, yeah, so these numbers are kind of damning for Trump, if you ask me. And then I went back and also pulled up some of these other numbers because I remember every time I see a poll, asking people questions about like Trump and the legality of what he's done. Every time people are like, oh, homie's a criminal by far. And it's like, and it's sort of like the Biden polls with age. Yeah. Like if you ask people like, is Biden too old to be president? It's like this 98% say Biden's too old to be president. It's not that much, but it's like 70 something percent, right? So for this one, it was a Quinnipiac poll, where 57% of Americans believe he should be disqualified. Trump should be disqualified in the event of criminal charges.
Criminal charges or conviction?
Criminal charges.
Whoa. Whoa.
Okay, I got another one for you.
I guess they're just being consistent then.
And then you have Donald Trump, if he's committed a crime, just committed a crime, over 60%. Oh, I'm sorry. 60% say he has committed a crime.
Okay.
Yeah. So, in other words, anytime you actually ask about this stuff, there's this weird feeling, this like status quo bias or like conventional wisdom bias in U.S. media where it's like, oh man, like, oh, don't poke the bear, don't go after Trump. Oh, this is never going to work. Teflon Don. But actually, the normie reaction is sort of like, fuck him. Get him out of here. Everybody knows he's a criminal. Like, that is the normie reaction.
Yeah, definitely. You know what was interesting to me? I don't know if you saw this poll. There's an Iowa caucus poll that tested a bunch of Trump's, like, insane statements to see how it landed with Republican caucus voters. And many of them, to our great chagrin, actually made people more likely to vote for him. So, for example, his thing about, like,
poisoning the blood of our nation.
Poisoning the blood of our, So that made people 42% more likely to vote for him and only 28% less likely. So on net with the Republican base, they're like, yeah, we like that. We're going to vote for him even harder now. The one that tested the worst, that overwhelmingly made people less likely to vote for him, was 2020 election fraud justifies terminating parts of the Constitution. And it made 47% of people less likely, so almost a majority, less likely to vote for him, and only 14% more likely to vote for him. And, you know, it made me question a little bit of the way that I was looking at the Republican base and the bind that people like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley were in going after him. Because I always felt like, you know, the things that are really the biggest problem with Trump that people hate the most about him, they're kind of off limits with the Republican base because they just see the world in this totally like upside down different way. But at least when it comes to like the chaos and the authoritarianism associated with his election fraud claims, there are a lot of people who are very uncomfortable with that in the Republican Party. And so I think they perhaps missed an opportunity to make something of that, because even there are plenty of normie Republicans who may even be open to some of his election fraud claims, but have this very like traditional conservative law and order view of like January 6th was a mess and it was chaos and it was bad. And I didn't really like that. And I wasn't really comfortable with it.
Yeah. I mean, in the midterms, 55% of the Republican candidates were election deniers. And everybody was saying going into a red wave, red wave, red wave. And I was like, I don't know about that. Because one of the things I thought was it's a bridge too far when people are still saying 2020 was bullshit at this late date.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, one of the reasons, along with abortion, why the Republicans sort of got wiped out. And so they keep getting smacked across the face with this lesson of like, your abortion position is too extreme and your election denialism is too extreme. And what you just read to me really points in that direction, that like, yeah, I remember when Trump said that on Truth Social, terminate the Constitution, anything to get me back in office, basically.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's insane. Like, that is insane. The percentage of people who are just going to flat agree with that comment, even among all the Trump sycophants in the country, et cetera, it's only going to be like 15% that are like, yeah, right on, terminate the Constitution.
14%, according to this poll in Iowa. And Iowa's a conservative place in terms of the Republican base and who actually is going to vote in a caucus. So, I mean, listen, obviously the approach that Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis took of like kid gloves with Trump, and like, you know, Nikki Haley, her signature move with her criticisms of Trump is to find the like 3 things Trump did that were actually good and be like,
you know, he spent a lot of money.
Yeah.
It was an $8 trillion deficit.
The new one is, I don't think he should have been criticizing Netanyahu right when they're facing this terrorist attack. It's like, that's your criticism of him, that he said something bad about Bibi Netanyahu. Anyway, so that's her go-to move. But, you know, hindsight's 2020, and who knows if it would have worked. But you could have at least tried to make a case against him based on the things that just like normie Americans find to be terrible and abhorrent and like unjustifiable about his presidency.
Yeah, but look, that's the thing we're going to see with this case. Because again, if the court, there's plenty of arguments there the court could make to say, yeah, you're kicked off the ballot. And we went through a bunch of them here. But I don't know if they will ever fully digest that, like, yes, this is actually the popular position. This is the normie American position. That if you're a fucking criminal, never mind somebody charged with 91 crimes, never mind somebody who's just found liable of civil fraud in New York and is going to have to pay a fine up to $250 million and lose his business license there. All these things people look at, the normie perspective is, this guy's a fucking problem.
Yeah.
And so if you wanna off him as a result of that,
hey, listen.
Look, I'll say this: it's the least bad scenario moving forward.
How about we do this? If we're concerned about the democratic process. Let's do a nationwide ballot initiative. Let's put it to the voters, have them vote on this discrete question, and see how it comes out, whether they want them on the ballot or not.
You got the Republicans now saying maybe we'll start kicking Joe Biden off the ballots in our states.
Oh no, that would be so terrible.
Everybody's like, oh boy, yeah. No,
I'd be heartbroken. One thing I wanted to ask you about, though, in that same vein, is because I saw like Cornel West and some other lefties who are basically making the slippery slope argument of, oh, the next time there's like a rowdy left-wing protest, they're going to be kicking President AOC or whoever off the ballot. So be careful what you wish for. What do you make of that like slippery slope argument that once it's used against Trump, then it is going to be potentially used against some dissident voice of someone we may actually like?
So they're going to go after the left no matter what.
Yeah.
Is point number one. Point number two is the left hasn't done anything remotely close to January 6th, nor will they. That's point number two. And then the final point is, look, you have to evaluate based on the evidence in front of you. And my perspective is, even though I think it's a very difficult legal question, my like colloquial understanding, looking at the evidence that's presented to me, looking at that provision of the Constitution, I go, you absolutely can look at this and say, yeah, sorry, you can't run. If a New Mexico elected official is not allowed to hold his position because he was just at January 6th, what about the guy who led the charge? What about the guy who was directly involved with the planning? What about the guys who were sending back and forth to each other? Here is our fraudulent elector plan. Here's our fake elector memo. This will be illegal vote counting if we do it. Well, don't use those words. This email will maybe become public at some point. When you go through all the specifics, it's very clear. Not only did he want it to happen, he was the ringleader in many respects. He gave a speech right before saying, march to the Capitol, got to be strong, got to take your country back with strength. I hope Mike Pence does the right thing. I hope he does the right thing. And then when he didn't, quote, do the right thing and the crowd was chanting, hang Mike Pence, there was reporting that he was like, well, maybe he deserves it. He deserves it because he didn't do the right thing by overturning the will of the people and doing a full authoritarian takeover, a coup in this country.
Yeah.
So I look at all the facts and it's like, look, you can have those conversations about like, well, what about this scenario? What about that scenario? What if we extrapolate it? What if we switch the positions, et cetera? All those, it's fair from an intellectual perspective, it's fair to do. But the most important thing from a legal perspective is you have to deal with the law and the facts of the case directly in front of you. And if you do that in this instance, there absolutely is a strong argument to say, sorry, he's off the ballot, he's not going to run again. Yeah. Whether or not that position is going to win out is a separate conversation because, again, it is an overwhelmingly conservative Supreme Court. They might be scared, like you say, of the consequences of it invoking themselves directly. But look, in the past, they did it in the 2000 election, but it was actually stealing.
We're not afraid of stealing an election and making history and whatever in 2000. I'll just say, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. Just final point is if Trump is removed, then the Republicans are going to win the election. I'm serious. If Trump is removed, you're either going to get Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis, and then they will and mark my words, they will definitely beat Joe Biden. Definitely.
So that is maybe a pretty powerful incentive for the Supreme Court. One thing on the slippery slope thing. I do get kind of frustrated with these arguments because they always result in like pretending like people don't have a brain and can never see the difference between X and Y event. Like anyone who was there alive on January 6th watching the media coverage knew, and even Republicans knew on that day, now they're sounding a different tone, but they knew on the day, like, this is different. This is really bad. This is something we have not seen before in our lifetimes. And so if you're just always going to resort to the slippery slope argument of like, oh, well, it's being used in an appropriate way now, but maybe it'll be used in an inappropriate way in the future. It's like, that's all going to be the case for like literally anything.
Everything. And then when we cross that bridge, by the way, what I'll say is, hey, this actually doesn't apply here.
This doesn't apply, and here's why. And
it
here's
does
how
here,
it's
it doesn't
different,
here.
and here's the test, and whatever. So anyway.
I would ask him, is there what would the facts have to be on the ground for you to say this is fair vis-a-vis going after Trump? Would he have to walk in to the Capitol holding a machine gun and start shooting at Chuck Schumer?
Right.
Like, what would have had to happen? What are the facts on the ground where you would say, oh, you know, I'm a little too far.
Right.
Maybe a little bit too far. Because I got news for you. No matter how extreme he went, he would still be leading in the Republican primary. And for you to say, well, we should kick him out because of this, they'd be like, oh, undemocratic.
But what about democracy? And look, again, then your beef is with the Constitution.
Right.
Really.
Yeah.
Not with the application of what is in the Constitution currently. But that feels too uncomfortable. And that is a very non-normie argument to make that like, oh, this part of the Constitution where we're banning people committed insurrection from holding office. Like, actually, I think insurrectionists should be able to hold office. It's not really a popular position.
The final point I'll make in response is that they'll be like, well, but this wasn't really an insurrection, or since it had like no chance of working, therefore it shouldn't count as an insurrection. I just think both those arguments are bad. because even if it didn't have a good chance of working, even if it's a bunch of fucking idiots, the intent is what mattered.
That's
and their
right.
intent was super duper clear.
Yeah.
That part is not debatable.
Yeah, like if you tried to commit a murder, but you did it with like, you know, like a letter opener and you screwed it all up. The fact that you tried to commit
I didn't actually murder
I didn't actually do it, so no harm, no foul, right?
Let me off, bro.
You still tried to commit murder, so it's still a problem.
Exactly.